Does the story of St. Paul in Acts really prove the divinity of Christ? Well, you know what? I'm going to give the fundamentalist Christians all their assumptions about the legitimacy of Acts and assume that the stories were written by Luke and still show that it doesn't prove anything. Now, a huge sounding board for the Christian fundamentalist apologists in terms of the conversion of Saul to Paul as being completely legitimate and thus proving the resurrection of Christ as legitimate is usually confirmed in their minds of the legitimacy of the book of Acts written by Paul's traveling companion, the physician and Gentile Luke. And it is hotly debated among biblical scholars whether Luke's writings of Acts can stand independently and legitimate, not influenced by other writings from Paul or taken from other writings such as his letters known as epistles. Because the fact is, like all the writings, we can't conclusively prove who the author actually is. My sourced research says that the oldest we have of Luke is Papyrus 91, where the earliest copies were found in the middle 3rd century. And those fragmented writings are thought to be Luke, but the author is actually unknown. And of course we know the story of the conversion from Saul to Paul, who became an icon in spreading the Christian message, as well as the legitimacy of the resurrection of Christ and all his miracles. Christian tradition states that the once Saul was on the road to Damascus, was thought to be a high Pharisee who was actually on his way to round up recent converts, in which he held great opposition, at which he suddenly saw a light, heard a voice, and the Lord struck him blind for 3 days, in which he was led by his companions to the disciple Ananias, who some scholars regard as a prophet, and was baptized, in which his name was changed from Saul to Paul. And of course, his traveling companion was Luke, who was thought to be a physician. And Luke in Acts in chapter 9 and chapter 22 confirms the once Saul's supernatural experience of hearing the voice of Jesus, which led to his conversion. Now, I've read many theories about why this man could have suddenly lost his sight, only to regain it a few days later. Some say he may have had sunstroke. Some say a possible seizure with a temporary loss of sight. He may have even had a version of desert snow blindness from the glare. But you know what? We can't prove any of that either. It's just speculation. And of course, the problem is we have no original copies or authorship of either the Pauline epistles or the book of Acts. The oldest we have of the Pauline epistles, I mentioned in another video as P46, and that's thought to be 175 to 225 AD. And the oldest copies that we have of Acts, my sources say was in the middle of the 3rd century. And by cross-checking historical markers, many scholars think that whoever wrote the book of Acts wrote it somewhere between 70 and 90 AD, which as we know is almost 40 to 60 years after Jesus was crucified. But you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go ahead and assume that these later copies are exact replicas from the book of Acts that Luke originally wrote. And I'm giving great latitude to the Christian fundamentalists because I have a point to prove here. Because I want to show that even if I do assume this, your argument is still ridiculous for the resurrection of Christ's legitimacy. So let's assume that Luke wrote it down exactly as Paul explained it to him, because the physician Luke would have met Paul after his conversion. Well, first of all, you have a problem with the writing itself of Acts. In Acts 9, verse 7, Saul's traveling companions stated that they also heard a voice. In Acts 22, verse 9, it states they did not. So already you have a variation of the story. But let's say that Saul's conversion to Paul, in his mind, happened exactly the way he wrote it down. Let's say he explained to Luke later on that it happened just the way he thought it. And let's say they did travel together to Greece, Macedonia, and Jerusalem, which the scholars think they did somewhere between 51 and 58 AD. My answer to all that is, so what? Does that make the story even remotely legitimate? Basically, what we're saying is that one man claimed to have this supernatural experience, but there is exactly zero signed witness to anyone around him who could have testified that he was struck blind. And if he did meet the later Ananias, well, then you have two Christians that are just confirming their Christianity to each other. And then later on, he meets a person who we'll assume is the physician the Bible says, and he evangelizes him into the Christian faith. And then they both traveled to various countries, evangelizing Christianity. Why is this a confirmation of legitimacy of anything? Just because people went around spreading a faith of a new religion doesn't mean what they claimed happened to them did. And the only person claiming that this miraculous supernatural experience happened to Paul is Paul. Luke simply believed it and is repeating a story, in which the Christian fundamentalist will say, well, why would somebody make that up? Are you kidding me? Christian evangelists make up things all the time. Again, I will use the example of Joseph Smith, who had 11 signatures witnessing his supernatural experience, and we know who those witnesses are, and we can confirm that they actually lived, but yet you don't believe the Joseph Smith story. Saul could have been temporarily blinded for the reasons I just stated, and misconstrued that as a supernatural experience. He could have been in a delirium and heard a voice in his head, possibly he was dehydrated, or he could have just been plain lying. I think Joseph Smith was absolutely lying about seeing the angel Moroni, and I think all of his 11 witnesses who heard God's voice and saw the golden plates delivered by Moroni were lying as well, because that's what cult members do. Because the fact is, neither Luke or Paul ever met Jesus. Why would they convert? Who knows, for any number of reasons. And the story of Joseph Smith is an old story, but let's look at even today's times. The Burpo family, where Colton Burpo supposedly went to heaven, has amassed a huge following. All those people are 100% convinced that Colton Burpo went to heaven, and all of them are telling everyone they know of this experience, even though they were not there to witness, not to mention the fact that the boy was never clinically dead. Surely they would know by now that he wasn't clinically dead. You can look it up in Psychology Today in an article. But yet they're still spreading this message in the Heaven is for Real ministries. And just walk into any fundamentalist church in modern era. You'll hear half those people talking about being witness to miracles. Miracles which no one has ever seen except them. The one Saul could have simply been sick in the desert, thought he was going to die, and thought it was God's punishment for persecuting the newly formed Christians. We don't know why he thought he had a supernatural experience, but there's a number of reasons of why he could have thought that, just like the reasons that people lie about supernatural experiences today and even form church cults of people who follow them and believe them. Now, Christian fundamentalist, I just gave you some great latitude of assumption that Paul is who you think he is, Luke is who you think he is, and that the copy of Acts was written exactly like the original copy. And that is assuming a lot. And even with that, you would still be just relying on a story told by one man with no corroborating witnesses, because we don't have any corroborating authorship of original writings from Damascus, even if he did meet Ananias to be baptized. And that's your best case Christian fundamentalist, and it still holds water like a bucket missing the bottom. And this is what you'll find, Christian fundamentalists, if you actually start thinking for yourself and researching objectively. Your beloved apologists do not have evidence as they claim. They have speculation, and it's poor speculation at best. And as long as you have nothing but poor speculation, I cannot accept the resurrection of Christ. And if you'd like to see some more videos where I slam dunk debunk Christ's resurrection, hit the end card at the end of the video, and I'll see you next time as we once again take that sword of reason and reality and thrust it right through the heart of ignorance.